A quiet archive record. Area 51 case files. Records show that the story of Area 51 is not told in alarms or revelations, but in routines, in flight manifests, in sealed schedules, in movements so ordinary they disappear into habit. This archive does not seek to reveal what was built or tested, but how secrecy became a daily rhythm for those who lived alongside it. These are not tales of invasion or panic, but of silence, distance, and continuity. These are some of the notable events surrounding the infamous area. Chapter 1: The Janet Flights. Every weekday morning, long before Las Vegas woke up, the same thing happened. While the Strip still glowed and casino floors hummed with a few remaining night shift gamblers, a quieter movement unfolded at the western edge of McCarran International Airport. Away from the terminals where tourists queued and flight numbers blinked on departure boards, a private access road led to a fenced-off ramp that did not appear on public maps. There were no signs pointing the way, no airline logos, no advertisements. Even most airport employees never went near it. Those who did understood, without being told, that questions were unnecessary. Shortly before dawn, a small group of buses arrived. They came from different parts of the city and surrounding suburbs, collecting passengers along routes that changed subtly over time. No two buses carried the same combination of people day after day. Pickup points were designed to look unremarkable. Office parks, empty parking lots, anonymous corners of industrial zones. The passengers boarded quietly. They wore clothes that blended easily into any workplace: khakis, jackets, work boots, windbreakers, sometimes polo shirts with no visible logos. Nothing about them suggested secrecy. Nothing about them suggested urgency. What stood out was how they moved. They did not linger. They did not chat casually. Conversations, if they happened at all, were low and brief. Most people already knew one another, at least by face. Yet familiarity did not translate into openness. Years of repetition had trained them otherwise. At the ramp, security personnel waited with clipboards and printed manifests. There were no boarding passes, no electronic scanners. Identification was checked visually against lists that changed daily. The process was quick and practiced. If a name matched, the person boarded. If it did not, the conversation ended there. No explanations were offered. The aircraft parked on the tarmac was always the same. A white Boeing 737, unmarked except for a thin red stripe running lengthwise along the fuselage. No airline name, no destination. From a distance, no visible registration number. The plane looked deliberately incomplete, as if branding itself would defeat the point. Officially, it did not exist. Inside military and aviation circles, it was known as Janet. No one ever offered an official explanation for the name. Over time, workers created their own interpretations. Just another non-existent terminal was the most common. Others suggested it was simply a placeholder that stuck. Whatever the truth, the nickname reflected a shared understanding. This flight was meant to disappear into routine. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was subdued. There was no music, no announcements, no in-flight magazine. Seats filled quickly, but not fully. Empty rows were normal. No one asked why. Some passengers slept almost immediately, trained by years of early mornings to take advantage of the brief rest. Others stared forward or out the window, watching the city lights slide past below. Few spoke. Those who did kept their voices low and neutral. Topics avoided work automatically. Families, sports, traffic, anything that anchored conversation firmly outside the fence. The flight itself was short. After takeoff, the plane climbed and turned north, leaving the familiar grid of Las Vegas behind. Civilian air traffic corridors were avoided with precision. The route was exact, approved in advance, and rarely altered without reason. From the ground, the aircraft looked ordinary, just another early morning departure. From inside the cockpit, the airspace ahead was anything but. The plane crossed into restricted zones that civilian pilots were trained to avoid without ever being told what lay beyond them. The charts simply marked the area as prohibited. No landmarks, no explanations. Below, the city gave way to desert. The change was abrupt. Lights vanished, roads disappeared. The landscape flattened and then broke into ridges and dry lake beds that reflected the growing light of dawn. There were no towns, no vehicles, no signs of life. Then straight lines appeared. Runways cut sharply across the terrain, unmistakable against the natural irregularity of the desert. Hangars emerged as geometric shadows. Roads intersected at deliberate angles, forming patterns that did not belong to nature. The aircraft descended toward Groom Lake. On no civilian map did the place exist as an airport. On no public aviation chart was it labeled clearly. Officially, it was part of the Nevada Test and Training Range, a vast expanse of restricted land used for military purposes. Unofficially, it already carried another name. Area 51. The plane touched down without ceremony. There was no terminal building waiting, no jet bridges, no signage welcoming arrivals, just tarmac, hangars, and a control tower that communicated exclusively on closed channels. The passengers disembarked quickly. Buses waited nearby, engines running. Each was identical from the outside. Inside, routes diverged. Some headed toward hangar complexes, others toward office structures set farther back. A few went deeper into the installation, past areas most workers never saw. No signs indicated destinations. The passengers knew which bus to board because they had been trained to know. Orientation briefings made this clear from the beginning. You learned what applied to you. You did not ask about anything else. Information flowed downward, never sideways. Curiosity was not punished, but it was redirected. Here, knowing less was a form of professionalism. As the buses pulled away, the Janet plane remained on the runway briefly, empty and silent. Soon it would depart again, returning to Las Vegas with nothing but unused seats and the illusion that nothing unusual had occurred. By mid-morning, it would be parked back at McCarran, indistinguishable from any other corporate aircraft. This cycle repeated every weekday. Hundreds of people moved through this system daily. Engineers, technicians, pilots, analysts, security staff, contractors. Some had worked at Groom Lake for decades. Others were new, still adjusting to the peculiar rhythm of living two lives. At home, they were ordinary. They attended school events. They shopped for groceries. They discussed weekend plans. When asked what they did for work, they gave answers that were true enough to end the conversation without inviting more. I work for the government. I'm an engineer. I'm in aviation. None of these were lies. At work, they were anonymous. Names mattered only within narrow contexts. Titles were often vague by design. Projects were identified by numbers or code names that changed over time. What mattered was task completion, not recognition. Silence was not enforced through constant reminders. It was enforced through normalization. Over time, secrecy stopped feeling dramatic. It became administrative. The people who rode the Janet flights did not think of themselves as guardians of great mysteries. They were professionals solving technical problems. They calibrated sensors. They refined materials. They pushed performance envelopes incrementally, methodically. They worked on aircraft that flew higher, faster, and quieter than anything the public believed possible. Platforms designed to evade radar before radar evasion was acknowledged. Propulsion concepts tested years before anyone outside the fence would hear rumors of them. Most of what they did would not be revealed for decades. Some of it would never be revealed at all. What they did not always consider was how this appeared from the outside. Beyond the restricted airspace, civilians occasionally noticed strange lights moving across the sky. Objects that seemed to hover, accelerate, or change direction without banking. Pilots flying commercial routes reported radar returns that behaved oddly or appeared at impossible altitudes. Local newspapers printed brief accounts. Authorities filed reports. The stories accumulated quietly. Inside the fence, those same events were known quantities. Test flights scheduled months in advance. Performance checks conducted at precise altitudes. Vehicles operating at the edge of what materials and aerodynamics could sustain. Outside the fence, context was missing. And without context, the human mind filled the gap. The Janet flights continued regardless. They carried people who understood exactly what they were seeing, and people who understood only their fragment of it. They moved knowledge inward and silence outward. They allowed Groom Lake to function smoothly while leaving the surrounding world to interpret incomplete information. The system worked because it was boring. There were no dramatic convoys, no sirens, no visible urgency, just a plane that left before dawn, landed in the desert, and returned as if nothing had happened. Day after day, year after year, generations of workers passed through the same routine. Some retired, some moved on to other projects. A few stayed long enough to see aircraft they once worked on appear years later in history books, stripped of context but framed as breakthroughs. They rarely commented. By the time the sun rose fully over the mountains each morning, Groom Lake was already active. Meetings underway, tests planned, data flowing into systems designed to store it quietly, and the Janet plane was already gone. Its passengers absorbed into hangars, laboratories, and offices that officially did not exist. Their presence erased by routine, their work hidden behind layers of classification and habit. Somewhere beyond the restricted airspace, someone would later look up at the sky and remember seeing something strange. A light, a movement, a moment that did not fit expectations. They would tell the story carefully at first, then with growing confidence. They would never know that its origin began quietly, hours earlier, on a flight that was never meant to be noticed. Chapter 2: Groom Lake at Night. At night, Groom Lake became what it was designed to be. During the day, the base functioned like any other workplace shaped by routine and human presence. Schedules governed activity. Meetings happened. Vehicles moved with purpose across familiar routes. Noise existed, even if muted. People occupied the space in visible, comprehensible ways. Night stripped most of that away. As the sun dropped behind the surrounding ranges, Groom Lake transitioned into a different mode of existence. Fewer people, fewer vehicles, fewer decisions made in real time. What remained was watching. The dry lakebed itself was the first instrument. Flat, pale, and unnaturally smooth, it stretched out beneath the night sky, like a prepared surface rather than a natural one. Engineers had learned early on that the lake bed amplified contrast. Any light crossing it stood out sharply. Any movement disrupted its uniformity. Dust patterns, tire marks, heat signatures, all were visible in ways they would not be on broken terrain. This was not incidental. It was one of the primary reasons Groom Lake had been chosen decades earlier. Long before advanced sensors were commonplace, the environment itself served as an extension of the base's detection systems. At night, the lake bed reflected moonlight and starlight, just enough to reveal motion without illuminating detail. It made the unusual visible while keeping the familiar subdued. As darkness settled fully, lighting across the base reduced to essentials. Runway lights were shielded and directional, visible only from precise approach angles. Taxiway markers traced paths that did not exist on any civilian chart. Hangar lights were internal, sealed behind thick doors and controlled apertures. Nothing pointed upward unless absolutely required. From the surrounding hills, Groom Lake appeared dormant, a dark void surrounded by darker desert. No glow, no beacon, no indication that thousands of hours of work had shaped the place. Inside the perimeter, activity continued. Night crews took over quietly. These were not administrative shifts or maintenance-only rotations. Night work was purposeful. Testing that required stable atmospheric conditions, calibration that demanded minimal interference, flights that benefited from empty airspace and reduced observation. Civilian air traffic thinned dramatically after sunset. Weather patterns often stabilized. Thermal turbulence decreased. These conditions made night ideal for controlled experimentation. Radar systems shifted into night profiles. Sensitivity thresholds were adjusted. Filters were applied differently. Optical sensors recalibrated for low-light environments. Infrared systems monitored heat signatures across wide swaths of airspace. Communications narrowed. Channels encrypted. Redundancies tested. Everything that happened was recorded. Not explained, not interpreted, recorded. Logs filled steadily. Timestamps, sensor readings, visual confirmations, cross-checks between systems. When something behaved as expected, it was noted briefly. When something deviated, it was documented carefully, without language that suggested meaning. Groom Lake did not speculate. It accumulated. This approach had been refined since the earliest days of the base. In the 1950s, when experimental reconnaissance aircraft first took to the air, pilots generated sightings that baffled civilians far beyond the perimeter. Silver shapes at extreme altitude, slow-moving lights long after sunset, objects that seemed to hover or drift without propulsion. Inside the base, those flights were understood down to the minute. Outside, they became mysteries. That lesson stayed embedded in procedure. Night operations were designed not only to test equipment, but to contain interpretation. Flights followed tightly controlled corridors. Altitudes were chosen carefully. Lighting configurations were minimized or altered to reduce recognition. If lights were visible, they were deliberate. If something appeared outside those expectations, the assumption was not intrusion. It was observation. On the ground, security patrols moved continuously. Vehicles traced loops that changed subtly night to night, preventing predictability. Perimeter teams monitored access roads, ridgelines, and known observation points. Cameras tracked terrain far beyond the visible fence line. Motion sensors extended awareness deep into the surrounding desert. The perimeter was not static. It breathed. Warning signs marked the outer boundary clearly. They were not symbolic. Restricted area. Use of deadly force authorized. The language was blunt because ambiguity invited testing. Enforcement, when required, was quiet, immediate, and final. The people assigned to perimeter duty understood their purpose. They were not there to investigate what might be happening in the sky. They were not tasked with curiosity. Their role was distance, maintaining it, enforcing it, doing so without escalation whenever possible. Inside the hangars, night amplified compartmentalization. Teams worked on isolated systems under controlled lighting. One crew focused on structural integrity measurements. Another calibrated propulsion test equipment. Another monitored instrumentation that would later be used to assess flight performance. No single group saw the entire platform. This was intentional. Compartmentalization prevented leaks, but it also prevented mythology from forming internally. People rarely speculated about projects beyond their scope because there was little to speculate with. They worked on what they could measure. Even so, certain things were impossible to ignore. At night, lights sometimes appeared above the surrounding ranges or crossed the sky at angles that did not resemble conventional flight. Some belonged to known test vehicles returning to base. Others were classified platforms transiting through restricted corridors, their existence known only to a small subset of personnel, and some were simply logged. Not every entry carried an explanation. This fact mattered more than outsiders ever realized, because Groom Lake did not exist in isolation. Beyond the fence, civilians camped, hiked, and watched the sky from miles away. They saw lights rise suddenly, hover briefly, or accelerate with no visible exhaust. They heard nothing. They saw no navigation strobes, no contrails. From their vantage points, the night sky behaved unpredictably. They filled in the gaps themselves. Inside the base, those same events were stripped of drama. They became timestamps and sensor returns. Known unknowns. Items flagged for later review, or sometimes never revisited at all. The difference was not what happened, it was who was allowed context. As the night deepened, activity slowed but never ceased. Essential systems remained active. Sensors continued scanning. Reduced crews monitored status displays and environmental readouts. Personnel rested lightly, trained to respond if required. Groom Lake never slept fully. It existed in a permanent state of attention. Even during quiet hours, when no aircraft moved and no tests were scheduled, the base listened. Airspace remained monitored. Ground sensors remained live. Cameras remained pointed outward. Silence itself was data. Occasionally, something would pass through restricted airspace without prior scheduling. A transient signal, a brief radar return, a visual anomaly that lasted seconds before vanishing. These events were logged without alarm. Follow-up occurred methodically, if at all. Unknown did not mean urgent. It meant incomplete. As dawn approached, the eastern horizon lightened almost imperceptibly. Night operations transitioned smoothly into morning profiles. Systems shifted configurations. Logs were finalized and archived. Preparations began for the return of human density. The first Janet flights would arrive soon, bringing people back into a space that had spent hours operating largely on its own. To the outside world, nothing had happened. Just desert, just darkness, just silence. Inside Groom Lake, another night had been documented, categorized, and sealed away. Another sequence of observations added to an archive that grew steadily. indifferent to speculation. And somewhere beyond the perimeter, someone would later remember seeing a light move across the sky. They would replay the moment in their mind, searching for meaning. They would describe it to others, cautiously at first, then with growing certainty. They would never know how quietly, how routinely, that same moment had already been written down, not as a mystery, but as a line in a log. Chapter 3. The Test Flight Era. Long before Groom Lake became a name whispered in documentaries, repeated in tabloid headlines, or debated endlessly on late-night radio shows, it was already shaping the way the public would come to understand and misunderstand the sky above them. The mythologies did not begin with secrecy for secrecy's sake. It began with technology moving faster than explanation. In the early 1950s, aviation still followed rules that felt intuitive to most people. Commercial aircraft flew low enough to be clearly seen. Their engines were loud, their silhouettes were familiar. Even military jets, still relatively new, behaved in ways that aligned with common sense. They climbed, cruised, descended. They left contrails. They followed airways. Altitude itself was a kind of boundary, an invisible ceiling beyond which nothing was expected to operate. That assumption would not survive the decade. By the middle of the 1950s, reports began filtering into newspapers, air traffic control logs, and military intelligence channels describing objects that did not behave as aircraft were supposed to. Airline pilots reported metallic shapes far above their cruising altitude. Ground observers described bright points of light that remained visible long after sunset, glowing against darkening skies before slowly fading away. Radar operators occasionally tracked returns that appeared briefly at extreme altitudes and then vanished without explanation. What made these sightings particularly unsettling was not their strangeness alone, but their consistency. They appeared repeatedly along specific corridors across the western United States, Nevada, Utah, California, New Mexico. They followed no commercial routes. They ignored established airspace patterns. To the public, this felt like intrusion. To Groom Lake, it felt like scheduling. Inside the base, there was no mystery. In 1955, the Lockheed U-2 had entered operational testing, designed for a single purpose: to fly higher than anything else in the sky. It represented a deliberate break from the limitations of conventional aviation. Its long, sailplane-like wings allowed it to operate above 70,000 feet, a realm no civilian aircraft could approach, and few military jets could even glimpse. From the ground, the U-2 did not behave like an airplane. Its slow speed at extreme altitude made it appear almost stationary. Its reflective surfaces caught sunlight long after the surrounding sky had darkened. To pilots flying far below, it occupied a region of the atmosphere that had previously been empty. There was no language for this yet, so people used the only term available to them: unidentified flying object. The spike in UFO reports during this period was immediate and measurable. Internally, intelligence agencies noticed the correlation almost as soon as the first flights began. UFO sightings surged precisely in regions where U-2 test missions were conducted. Civilian confusion mapped cleanly onto classified flight paths. Externally, nothing could be said. Acknowledging the aircraft would have meant acknowledging its mission: penetrating Soviet airspace during the most volatile phase of the Cold War. The secrecy surrounding the U-2 was not bureaucratic. It was existential. Exposure could have altered the balance of power, so the sightings were permitted to remain unexplained. Publicly, investigations produced inconclusive results. Explanations referenced weather phenomena, misidentified stars, atmospheric distortions. The language was intentionally non-committal. Behind closed doors, officials quietly logged another truth. The public was seeing real objects, just not ones they were allowed to know about. This pattern would repeat. As aviation technology advanced, the gap between what was being tested and what the public believed possible widened. By the early 1960s, Groom Lake had begun flying the A-12, a sleek, black aircraft capable of sustained speeds above Mach 3. It was hotter, faster, and stranger than anything that had come before. The A-12 did not linger in the sky. It crossed entire states in minutes. Its passage produced sonic booms far from conventional flight corridors. Observers described sudden, thunderous cracks followed by silence, with no aircraft visible overhead. Radar operators occasionally detected objects that appeared briefly and then outran tracking systems entirely. Again, confusion followed performance. The A-12's appearance compounded the problem. Its angular design, black skin, and elongated proportions did not resemble aircraft in popular imagination. It did not bank gracefully. It did not display blinking navigation lights. Seen at high altitude, often at dawn or dusk, it appeared as a dark shape sliding impossibly fast across the sky. To someone without context, it looked manufactured by something other than known aerospace engineering. Inside Groom Lake, engineers understood exactly what they were witnessing. Every test flight was monitored obsessively. Altitude, speed, thermal output, radar signature, nothing was left unmeasured. When civilian reports surfaced, they were quietly cross-referenced against test logs. The matches were often exact, but no corrections were issued, because to correct the misunderstanding would have revealed the truth. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, the cycle became self-sustaining. Advanced aircraft produced anomalous sightings. Secrecy prevented explanation. The absence of explanation fueled speculation. Speculation hardened into belief. By the time stealth technology entered testing phases, the situation had changed in a crucial way. The audience had grown, cameras became affordable, telescopes became common among amateur astronomers. Commercial air traffic increased, placing more trained observers in the sky. Population growth pushed civilians closer to restricted airspace boundaries. People no longer stumbled into sightings by accident. They went looking. From ridgelines near the Nevada test site, observers gathered at night, watching the sky for movement that defied expectation. They reported lights that did not blink, objects that hovered without sound, shapes that accelerated vertically or vanished instantly. Some of what they saw was exaggerated, some was misinterpreted, some was real. Inside Groom Lake, this escalation was not ignored. Flight schedules shifted later, routes were adjusted, lighting profiles were altered to minimize visibility, but absolute concealment was impossible. Aircraft still needed to fly. Physics still governed reflection, heat, and motion. The desert, vast as it was, did not swallow everything. What changed most dramatically was interpretation. Earliest sightings could be rationalized after the fact. Balloons, experimental aircraft, atmospheric effects. Later sightings resisted those explanations. The objects moved too fast, changed direction too abruptly, appeared too structured. The public was not being unreasonable. They were attempting to reconcile observation with an outdated model of technology, and Groom Lake could not update that model without compromising its mission. This was the moment mythology truly took hold. Not because the base intended to deceive, but because silence allowed imagination to become explanatory. Each unexplained event reinforced the idea that something non-human might be present. Each official denial, careful, evasive, incomplete, deepened distrust. Ironically, many personnel inside the base found the situation almost absurd. They knew exactly what was flying overhead. They had helped design it. They had watched it take off from desert runways and return coated in dust and heat scars. But they also understood that acknowledging reality was not an option. Secrecy was not a side effect of their work. It was the work. By the late 1980s, the accumulated weight of decades of sightings had transformed Groom Lake into something larger than a test site. It became a symbol, a placeholder for everything the public suspected but could not verify. Genuine test flights blended seamlessly with rumor, exaggeration, and fabrication. The truth existed in a narrow band between extremes. There were no extraterrestrial craft being reverse engineered in hangars, but there were machines so advanced that they violated every expectation civilians had about flight. Technology had outrun context, and context never caught up. When programs like the U-2 and SR-71 were finally declassified decades later, they explained many sightings retroactively, but not all of them. Memories had aged. Stories had evolved. Some accounts no longer aligned cleanly with known aircraft. By then, it no longer mattered. The myth had momentum. Groom Lake continued forward, preparing the next generation of tests, fully aware that whatever flew next would once again be seen from the outside as impossible. The cycle would repeat, not because deception was desired, but because explanation was prohibited. The test flight era did not invent UFO mythology. It constructed the conditions that made it inevitable. By pushing machines beyond public understanding and refusing to close the gap, Groom Lake transformed the sky into a canvas for belief. Every light became a question. Every anomaly became evidence. The aircraft were real. The confusion was real. And the silence ensured that the story would never fully resolve. What flew over the desert was human-made. What formed around it was something else entirely, and it would persist long after the aircraft themselves were retired, carried forward not by engines or wings, but by the enduring discomfort of unanswered observation. Something had been seen. Something had never been explained. And Groom Lake moved on, knowing that the next test would add another layer to a story that could no longer be contained. Chapter 4: The Camo Dudes and the Perimeter. The fence was the first thing people noticed. Not because it looked formidable, but because it didn't. In most places, it was simple chain link, the kind used around construction sites or industrial lots, topped with barbed wire that caught the desert sun during the day and dissolved into shadow at night. There were no guard towers rising dramatically against the skyline, no rows of floodlights sweeping back and forth, no obvious signs of a military fortress. That absence was intentional. What made the perimeter effective was not how it appeared up close, but how much territory it quietly claimed beyond the visible line. The fence was not the boundary. It was the final marker in a system that began miles earlier. Officially, the restricted area surrounding Groom Lake ended at clearly posted points. Warning signs were placed at regular intervals along dirt roads, dry washes, and hiking trails. They were unadorned, utilitarian, and blunt. Restricted area, no trespassing, use of deadly force authorized. There was no mystery in the language, no embellishment. The signs did not speculate about what lay beyond them. They did not threaten in dramatic terms. They stated a condition and a consequence. Most people who encountered them stopped. Some did not. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Groom Lake had shifted from obscure test site to cultural fixation. Aviation magazines mentioned it in passing. Whispers circulated on early internet forums. Locals swapped stories about lights in the sky and unmarked planes. A generation raised on Cold War secrecy had learned to distrust official silence. Curiosity became organized. Hikers ventured farther into the desert than before. Amateur photographers carried long lenses and tripods. Aviation enthusiasts studied maps and satellite images, searching for places where the terrain might offer a glimpse beyond the restricted zone. What they often encountered first were the men. They did not wear traditional military uniforms. There were no unit patches, no visible insignia, no name tapes. Their desert camouflage blended almost perfectly into the surrounding terrain, its muted tones matching the dust, scrub, and rock. Their boots were practical, their posture relaxed but precise. Their vehicles arrived quietly. White pickup trucks, unmarked SUVs, always clean, always in good condition. Government plates that revealed nothing. Among locals and watchers, they acquired a name almost immediately: the Camo Dudes. No one knew their official designation. Some assumed Air Force security forces. Others believed they were civilian contractors. In reality, the distinction mattered less than their function. They were the perimeter. Long before anyone reached a fence or a warning sign, they were already known. The perimeter was not a line. It was a depth. Motion sensors buried beneath dirt roads. Seismic detectors tuned to footsteps. Cameras concealed in rocks. Disguised so convincingly that even experienced hikers walked past them without noticing. Observation posts were placed on ridgelines miles away from the fence, invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. From there, the desert unfolded like a map. Any vehicle that stopped where it shouldn't, any person who lingered too long, any movement that broke the expected rhythm of emptiness. By the time a car door opened near a boundary marker, someone inside Groom Lake had already logged it. The Camo Dudes did not rush. If someone crossed a visible boundary unintentionally, a wrong turn, a misunderstood trail, the response was often calm and deliberate. A vehicle would appear without warning, rolling into view from behind a ridge or out of a dry wash. Many people later reported not noticing its approach at all. The men stepped out slowly. Their weapons were visible but never raised. Their posture communicated control, not urgency. The exchange followed a familiar script. You are in a restricted area. You need to leave. Now. Names were recorded. Identification was checked. Cameras were examined. Sometimes film was confiscated. Sometimes it wasn't. The decision depended on proximity, timing, and what the person might reasonably have seen. Those who complied were escorted back to public land and released without incident. Those who pressed further encountered a different response. People later described an unease that began long before anyone appeared. The sense of being observed, vehicles pacing them on distant ridgelines, engines starting somewhere behind them, then falling silent again. This was not accidental. Perimeter security at Groom Lake was not designed for dramatic confrontations. It was designed for discouragement. The goal was to end curiosity quietly, without escalation and without creating stories that would travel farther than the person who experienced them. Inside the base, perimeter enforcement was treated as its own discipline. Personnel were trained not only in law enforcement and weapons handling, but in behavioral management. How to project authority without intimidation. How to stop someone without provoking resistance. How to answer nothing while still appearing reasonable. Still, stories spread. Some civilians described firm but polite encounters. Others claimed they were detained aggressively. A few insisted they were photographed before they ever saw a guard. Their presence documented from a distance. The details varied. The outcome did not. No one crossed into Groom Lake without permission. Distance was the point, because just beyond the outer perimeter, the terrain changed. Low mountain ridges and elevated plateaus offered clear views of the sky above the base. During the day, these vantage points appeared ordinary, stretches of rock and scrub with no obvious significance. At night, they became something else. From those ridgelines, civilians saw lights rise silently from behind mountains, hover briefly, then accelerate away in ways that defied conventional expectations of aircraft. They heard no engines. They saw no exhaust. Sometimes the lights vanished instantly. Sometimes they lingered just long enough to raise questions. Inside the fence, these events were understood precisely. Test flights, system checks, platform evaluations, calibration runs. Every movement logged, monitored, and anticipated. Outside the fence, they became mysteries. Security patrols adapted accordingly. On nights when testing was scheduled, perimeter presence increased. Vehicles were positioned along likely access routes. Observation teams monitored known civilian gathering points, not to interfere unless necessary, but to ensure no one crossed into restricted ground. The camo dudes were not chasing UFOs. They were managing sight lines. Over time, frequent watchers learned the limits. They parked just far enough away to avoid confrontation. They used binoculars instead of cameras. They memorized patrol routes and shift changes. They shared tips quietly. Security adjusted. The perimeter shifted subtly over the years. New sensors replaced old ones. Trails that had once been accessible were quietly closed. Boundaries moved outward in some areas, inward in others. Public maps never reflected these changes. The fence remained only the final warning. What existed beyond it was a buffer zone, wide, quiet, and controlled with precision. And beyond that, the base itself remained invisible, shielded not by walls, but by layers of distance and discipline. For many observers, the presence of the camo dudes reinforced a powerful assumption. Whatever was happening at Groom Lake was valuable enough to protect at all costs, not symbolically, practically. That realization shaped the mythology as much as any light in the sky, because secrecy does not eliminate curiosity, it refines it. Every silent interception, every confiscated roll of film, every story about being turned back by unmarked vehicles added weight to the belief that something extraordinary lay just out of reach. Inside Groom Lake, perimeter personnel rotated shifts like anyone else. They ate meals, filed reports, drove home at the end of the week to families and ordinary lives. But while they were on duty, they embodied the boundary itself, a living line between what was known and what could not be acknowledged. They did not guard extraterrestrials, they guarded silence. And in doing so, they became part of the legend. Half-seen figures in desert camouflage, enforcing rules without explanation, ensuring that whatever happened beyond the fence stayed distant enough to remain unresolved. The perimeter did not reveal secrets, it preserved them, and that preservation ensured that the story of Groom Lake would continue to grow, not despite the camo dudes, but because of them. Chapter 5. Tikaboo Peak Watchers. They never crossed the fence. That rule was never written down, never enforced by anyone outside the group, but it was understood by everyone who came to watch. The fence was not a challenge to overcome. It was a line that defined the entire experience. Once crossed, the watching ended. Cameras were confiscated. Notes were taken by someone else. Stories stopped being personal and became reports. So they stayed back. By the early 1990s, curiosity about Groom Lake had matured into something quieter and more deliberate. The initial surge of thrill seekers and rumor chasers had thinned out. What remained was a smaller group of people willing to invest time, effort, and discomfort in exchange for uncertainty. These were not people looking for a moment. They were looking for consistency. The perimeter was well understood by then. Everyone knew where the warning signs stood, how far the buffer zones extended, how quickly unmarked vehicles appeared when someone tested the limits. Anyone serious about observing the base understood a simple truth. Getting closer did not mean seeing more. Distance was safer. Distance lasted longer. The place that made that distance possible was Tikaboo Peak. Rising just over 8,000 feet in the Papoose Range, Tikaboo was not convenient. The road leading toward it deteriorated quickly into ruts, rocks, and washouts. High-clearance vehicles were required, and even then, progress was slow. The final ascent could not be driven at all. It demanded hours of hiking over uneven ground, often under punishing conditions. In summer, the heat was relentless. In winter, the wind cut through layers and gloves. Spring brought mud and sudden storms. Fall brought early darkness and unpredictable temperatures. None of that deterred the people who came, because from the summit, something rare was possible. It was the only publicly accessible point from which a portion of Groom Lake's airspace, and on particularly clear days, parts of the base itself, could be seen directly without the aid of powerful telescopes or aircraft. Not clearly, but clearly enough. Those who made the climb did not arrive impulsively. Trips were planned weeks or months in advance. Weather was checked obsessively. Supplies were calculated carefully. Some coordinated in small groups, others preferred solitude. Many came from technical backgrounds, retired pilots who knew how aircraft were supposed to move, engineers who understood propulsion and control systems, radar technicians familiar with how objects appeared on screens versus how they behaved in reality. Others were photographers or amateur astronomers, drawn less by Groom Lake itself than by the challenge of observation under uncertain conditions. They brought folding chairs, coolers, notebooks, binoculars, cameras, telescopes. Some carried handheld radios tuned to aviation frequencies, though they understood that little of what happened near Groom Lake would ever be heard on open channels. They did not expect transmissions, they expected silence. What they hoped for were patterns. From Tikaboo Peak, the base itself remained distant and indistinct. Hangars appeared as pale geometric shapes against the desert floor. Runways sometimes caught the sun at just the right angle, reflecting light briefly before disappearing again. Vehicles moved like insects, slow and small, their purpose unreadable. The real focus was always the sky. As daylight faded, attention sharpened. The watchers understood that light conditions mattered as much as location. The hour before full darkness was often the most revealing. The sun sat low enough to illuminate high-altitude objects, while the ground below sank into shadow. That was when things appeared. Sometimes lights rose slowly from behind mountain ridges, climbing without visible acceleration. Sometimes they were already airborne, holding position briefly before moving laterally. The movement was what drew attention. Not raw speed, but behavior. Objects slid sideways without banking. They climbed vertically without visible thrust. They hovered, then departed at angles that ignored the expectations of conventional flight. When this happened, conversation became minimal. Not out of fear, out of focus. Details mattered. Direction of travel, duration, color changes, smoothness of motion, acceleration profiles. Everyone understood how easily memory could distort perception. Notes were taken quickly, often in near darkness. Cameras were used sparingly, because experience had taught them how little footage could capture. Arguments were rare, disagreements happened, but they were methodical. Someone would suggest a known aircraft type. Another would point out altitude inconsistencies. Satellites were considered. Reflections off the dry lake bed. Atmospheric effects. Lens artifacts. Most sightings were dismissed. That was not failure. That was discipline. The watchers were not there to believe. They were there to observe. This was what separated Tikaboo Peak from roadside watching or casual stargazing. Anyone willing to hike for hours into remote terrain, often multiple times a year, tended to approach the experience seriously. Many kept detailed logs. Some maintained spreadsheets. Others relied on memory, reinforced by repetition. Over time, patterns began to emerge. Certain nights were consistently more active. Testing seemed more common during specific seasons. Some years were quiet. Others produced clusters of unusual activity, followed by long stretches of nothing at all. The quiet periods were noted carefully. Absence was data too. Security presence was always felt, even when it was not seen. Watchers understood that they were not alone on the mountain, even if no vehicles approached. Occasionally, binoculars caught the faint glint of glass on distant ridgelines where no one had been before. Engines were sometimes heard starting far below, then shutting off again. But as long as the watchers stayed within legal boundaries, no one interfered. This restraint created an unspoken agreement. Observation was tolerated. Intrusion was not. The relationship between the watchers and Groom Lake settled into a strange equilibrium. The base continued its work. The watchers continued theirs. Each side was aware of the other. Neither acknowledged it openly. Stories circulated quietly among the group. Someone who saw a light split into two, then recombine. Someone who watched an object track a satellite across the sky before abruptly reversing direction. Someone who recorded video that, when reviewed later, showed nothing remarkable at all. Disappointment was common, but it did not discourage return trips. The watchers understood something fundamental. Most of what happened at Groom Lake was not designed to be seen. When something was visible from Tikaboo Peak, it was often incidental, a reflection, a test conducted at altitude, a moment when performance mattered more than concealment. That made each glimpse feel earned. Over time, small details took on disproportionate significance. A particular shade of amber light that appeared more than once. A recurring flight path that reappeared months apart. A behavior that repeated across different years under similar conditions. Individually, these details meant very little. Together, they formed a loose narrative, not of extraterrestrials, but of testing, of experimentation, of machines operating at the edge of known capability. Still, mythology grew. Newcomers arrived with expectations shaped by documentaries, books, and online forums. They wanted dramatic encounters, clear silhouettes, hovering craft directly overhead. Veterans learned to manage those expectations gently. "This place doesn't give you answers," they would say. "It gives you fragments." Fragments invited interpretation. Some watchers leaned toward exotic explanations. Others remained firmly grounded in aerospace development. Most occupied a middle ground, comfortable with uncertainty, willing to say, "I don't know," without frustration. What united them was patience. They were not chasing proof. They were witnessing a process. As years passed, access to Tikaboo Peak became more organized. Informal guides circulated. Advice about vehicles, weather, and safety was shared freely. The climb itself became part of the ritual, a reminder that observation required effort, and that distance was part of the bargain. From the summit, as night settled fully over the desert, Groom Lake remained quiet and far below. Lights appeared occasionally. More often, they did not. And somewhere between what was visible and what remained hidden, stories continued to form. Not from official statements, not from leaked documents, but from people sitting in folding chairs on a mountain, watching lights move across the sky, comparing notes and trying carefully not to exaggerate what they had seen. They never crossed the fence. They did not need to. The mystery lived comfortably at a distance, and in that distance, it endured. Chapter 6. The File That Stays Closed. In the end, there was never a single secret. That assumption that somewhere inside Groom Lake existed one extraordinary truth capable of explaining everything was the mistake that shaped decades of misunderstanding. It was comforting to believe in a single revelation, something dramatic enough that if exposed, it would suddenly align every rumor, sighting, and story into a coherent whole. But Groom Lake was never built to protect one answer. It was built to manage many small ones. Each compartment was narrow by design, each project isolated, each piece of information carefully limited to those who needed it. Engineers knew their systems, pilots knew their aircraft, security knew their zones, analysts knew their data. Very few people saw how these fragments aligned, and almost no one saw the entire picture at once. This was not deception for its own sake. It was survival through compartmentalization. The Janet flights were the first layer of this system. They turned secrecy into routine. By reducing extraordinary work to a daily commute, they removed drama from the act of hiding. Hundreds of people boarded those unmarked planes every week, carrying lunch bags and notebooks, thinking about deadlines and test schedules thus rather than history. The flight itself became invisible through repetition. Secrecy worked best when it felt boring. The plane left before dawn. It landed in the desert. It returned in the evening. Nothing about the process suggested mystery from the inside. That was the point. If secrecy became emotional, it became fragile. If it became ordinary, it endured. Then there was the base at night. Groom Lake after dark revealed its true purpose, not as a place of revelation, but as a place of observation. Systems monitored systems. Sensors watched sensors. Logs accumulated quietly. Anything unusual was recorded without speculation. Anomaly did not trigger panic or belief. It triggered documentation. Mystery was not denied. It was deferred. Nothing needed to be explained immediately if it could be contained, measured, and stored for later analysis. The base did not exist to interpret meaning. It existed to evaluate performance. If something could not be understood in the moment, it was simply set aside until it could be. That approach stood in sharp contrast to how the outside world experienced the same events. The test flight era added another layer. As aircraft pushed beyond what the public believed possible, the sky became a place where technology outpaced expectation. People saw lights and movements that did not fit the categories they understood. Objects flew too high, too fast, too strangely. Without context, observers reached for language that matched their experience rather than reality. Unidentified, unexplained, other. The sightings themselves were real. The conclusions were not always accurate, but accuracy was impossible without information, and information was exactly what could not be provided. Acknowledging the aircraft would have revealed their purpose. Revealing their purpose would have compromised national security. So the silence remained. That silence did not erase curiosity. It transformed it. The perimeter reinforced everything. By enforcing distance without explanation, security turned boundaries into symbols. The camouflaged vehicles, the silent interceptions, the confiscated film. None of it clarified what was being protected. Instead, it suggested value, importance, risk. Each boundary implied that something extraordinary lay just beyond it. Silence became evidence. The camo dudes were not myth makers by intent. They were professionals executing a security doctrine built around deterrence and discretion. But from the outside, their very presence fed speculation. A fence can be measured. A guard can be questioned. A silent interceptor who refuses to explain himself becomes something else entirely. Story. And then there were the watchers. From Tikaboo Peak and distant ridgelines, civilians attempted to do what secrecy prevented: assemble understanding from observation. They did not break rules. They did not trespass. They did not claim authority. They watched patiently, returning again and again, collecting fragments and comparing notes. They never saw the full picture. No one outside the fence ever could. What they gathered were glimpses, lights, movements, patterns that hinted at process without revealing purpose. They learned when activity was likely. They learned when nothing would happen at all. They learned restraint. In doing so, they became part of the system they were observing, because watching also shapes narrative. Each of these elements fed into the same outcome. Not disclosure, not denial, but mythology. Secrecy did not simply hide information. It structured belief. By withholding context while allowing phenomena to remain visible, Groom Lake created a space where imagination filled gaps that facts could not reach. The human mind does not tolerate uncertainty well. When explanation is absent, interpretation rushes in. The government did not invent UFO mythology deliberately. It allowed it to grow structurally. Every unexplained flight, every denied acknowledgement, every classified document that remained sealed added weight to a story people told themselves about what must be happening in the desert. Over time, that story became more cohesive than the truth ever could be, because the truth was fragmented, and fragmentation resists narrative closure. Some files never close, not because they contain forbidden knowledge, but because they were never designed to be complete. Each project had its own beginning and end. Each answer addressed a narrow question. No single document explained everything, because no single project encompassed everything. Even those working inside Groom Lake rarely saw beyond their assigned scope. An engineer might spend years perfecting a component without knowing what platform it belonged to. A pilot might fly an aircraft without knowing what data analysts would later extract from its performance. Security personnel might guard facilities without knowing what experiments occurred inside them. The system wasn't designed to reveal. It was designed to endure. Decades passed. Programs ended. Aircraft were retired. Some secrets were declassified long after they stopped mattering. Others remained sealed, not because they were extraordinary, but because reopening them served no purpose. Classification, inertia, replaced urgency. Silence persisted simply because nothing required it to end. By the time the public learned about the U-2, the A-12, the SR-71, stealth platforms, and experimental test programs, the mythology had already outgrown the facts. Too many sightings no longer aligned neatly with known aircraft. Too many memories had evolved. Too many narratives had layered themselves atop one another. Correction came too late, and so the files stayed closed, not locked, just unfinished. In the desert, the fences still stand, warning signs still face outward, unmarked planes still depart before dawn, lights still move across the sky on occasion, noticed by people who will later struggle to describe what they saw. Inside Groom Lake, observation continues as it always has, methodical, quiet, uninterested in belief. Systems are tested, data is recorded, performance is evaluated. The work proceeds without regard for mythology. Outside, people continue to watch. Between them lies the same distance that has always existed. Not just physical distance, but informational distance. A gap where certainty dissolves and interpretation takes over. A space where neither side can fully speak to the other. That gap is where the mystery lives, not in reminders of extraterrestrials, not in hidden conspiracies, but in the long silence between what is seen and what is explained. And until that silence is broken, not by spectacle, not by confession, but by context, the story will remain exactly where it has always been, partly known, partly imagined, and permanently unfinished. This was a quiet archive story, where the story ends, sleep begins,